Today we're heading to a magical land where you can swing for large migratory brown trout, hit some of those amazing hatches, and see some big game that are unique to the countryside. This place has been coined the Montana of 60 years ago, and today you're going to get a glimpse into northern Patagonia, so you know why this should be one of your bucket list trips. This is the Wet Fly Swing Podcast, where I show you the best places to travel to for fly fishing, how to find the best resources and tools to prepare for that big trip, and what you can do to give back to the fish species we all love. How's it going? I'm Dave, host of the Wet Fly Swing Podcast. I've been fly fishing since I was a little kid, grew up around a little fly shop, and created one of the largest fly fishing podcasts out there. Ron Sorensen, Chocolate Lab Expeditions founder and fly fishing nerd, takes us into his lodge on the Limay River and some of the similarities between Montana and fly fishing out of Montana and guiding, where he does his other half of the year. You're going to find out how to skate flies out of a drift boat for big brown trouts. We're going to find out how to hit some of the biggest hatches in this part of the world. We're also going to find out what the twitch and sit is all about. Plus, we're going to hear how these 80-acre ranches started out as big sheep farms and now are meccas of fly fishing. We're going to get into it all today, including the Chewbacca fly, why you should be thinking about the Chewbacca fly, fishing this one this year, this half streamer, half surface fly. All right, it's all coming today. Here he is, Ron Sorensen from CleeFlyFishing.com. How you doing, Ron?
I'm doing great, Dave. How are you today?
Great. Yeah, I'm glad you put some time together today to put this together. We're going to talk about a couple of places that are always hot topics, Montana, Patagonia. We've definitely had some episodes on it. It's been a little while for Patagonia at least, but we're going to talk about all that. We're going to get into some brown trout fishing and whatever else we come up with today. But I first want to start with a little on your background. I know we talked off air about Randall Kaufman. His name came up. You have some connection. I know Mike Lawson as well. But take us back real quick on fly fishing. Have you been doing this for a while, or are you a little later to the game?
No, I grew up in Portland, Oregon, and fly fishing with my grandfather, actually. So around 4 or 5 years old, they would take me down to the Metolius River, which you probably hold dear to your heart. And that's how I spent most of my summers growing up. Fly fished the Crooked River, and not so much the Deschutes from my dad, but a lot on the Crooked River until I got older. So that's
nice. That's it.
That was my youth.
That was your youth.
Yeah.
What was I always love the Crooked River because it's one of those local streams for Oregon. What years do you remember? Were you fishing the Crooked River for many, many years, or what do you remember the year roughly?
Oh, I probably fished it. So let's see, I was born in 71. So I probably fished it from 76 through 88, probably all through there.
Okay, this is perfect. Do you remember that pretty well, the Crooked River back then?
I do, yeah. I mean, we always went to the same little stretch that I remember. I mean, I'd have to try to find it again on a map.
Yeah.
My dad bait fished, and so we'd actually go and collect what he called periwinkles. So we go collect case caddis, and then that really was actually my first introduction. And then later that sort of transfused into nymph fishing later. But we'd fish ultralight tippet, or line, and then run a split shot, and then bounce the periwinkles down the river. And so then later that sort of like that translated over into nymph fishing, when nymph fishing wasn't, initially when I was growing up with my grandfather, he'd fish those bucktails and swing flies, and they were all sort of approximations of salmon fly patterns or golden stone patterns. So I remember when pinch on indicators first came out in the Cam Sherman fly shop, probably in like 86,
right.
We were figuring out there they were, but nobody really knew how to use them because videos weren't a thing yet.
That's great. And do you remember on the Crooked River, were you guys getting some pretty large fish out there? What was the size look like back then in the 80s?
I'd say that the average fish were, probably 12 to 16, 17 inches were probably the average. And then, occasionally we'd find, crayfish. And then like my dad would fish with crayfish tails. And I think, I probably over those long weekends that we go with my dad, maybe we get 2 or 3 that were in that 20, that were honest 20-inch fish. Yeah.
And then when did you get into like the connection with Randall Kaufman and kind of start getting into more of the fly fishing end of it, the industry end?
So, with my grandfather, we always, in the Metolius, we were purely fly fishing. And with my dad, it was always a mix. So we'd go to Crane Prairie Reservoir, and my dad just loved to fish. It didn't matter in what sort of state it came in, he loved to fish. So we'd, fly fish if that was what the rules were, and bait fish if that was, acceptable. But I was 16 when we had a school project where you were supposed to donate, a couple weeks working in a local business. And so my mom wanted me to go down to donate my time at the bank. And then when I figured out a bunch of my buddies were going to go ski with, up at Ski Patrol on Mount Hood, I figured that I should come up with my own plan. So my mom wasn't home one day when I came back from school. So I walked down to Randall's door and I knocked on his door and offered to work for free at his fly shop for 2 weeks. So
wow.
That's how I got my start. And Randall was, of course, like, well, for sure, free labor. That's awesome. Yeah. So that's how I got started, was working in a shop on this sort of the school project. And we hit it off. He was fantastic, I'd never met anybody that was, into it like to that level, obviously.
Right.
And my grandfather liked to do it, but it was as much as filling up the quota on this, at that point, the Metolius was really a put and take fishery, right? So my grandfather, the good accountant, CPA that he was, he'd go down and he'd fill in his roster of hatchery fish for the day, and then that was it. And so where I was, it took me till I was about 13. I was like, well, what if we just kept 4 and then we could, just keep fishing for the rest of the day. And we wouldn't have to stop, which, grandpa, that didn't compute. But Randall, of course, understood all that you didn't actually need to keep any, and you could just fish all day. So that was really when things started to evolve in at a lightning fast pace, so to speak. So that was really a fruitful relationship, and it was Randall that then wrote me my first recommendation and helped me get my first guide job in Montana, which was in 91.
And when you were at Randall's, I mean, that was kind of one of the big places out. Was it kind of popping then? Was there a lot of business, a lot of traffic? It seems like that was kind of the heyday of Randall, at least somewhere in there, right? A lot of travel. They were a big travel group and all that.
Oh, absolutely. So at that time frame in the mid, I probably came in sometime in that, I guess it would be the mid 80s. So that it probably was at its peak. I mean, that was the catalog that, or Dan Bailey's, that that had arrived to your house, and you'd see, all their fly tying products were in that catalog. I mean, that was sort of the end and the heyday of that time frame before the internet came along. So it was, it was probably Kaufman Streamborn and Dame Bailey's were probably at least the major players in my orbit at that time, for sure.
Yeah.
So they had a whole library of all these VHS, cassettes. And so at the end of the day, Randall, any ones that weren't rented out, I could take home for the night and then bring them back in the morning. And so then that was, sort of my first exposure to, Lonnie Waller and like all the, Jack Dennis and his fly tying, series. And that was really what expanded my, exposure to the whole fly fishing world.
Right. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and we just had Jack Dennis on the show again here recently. It was good to catch up with him. He's obviously out in Jackson Hole, kind of a different area, but still obviously out west. No, this is great. Well, let's fast forward a little bit. So you get into the guiding. Eventually, maybe let's just jump right into is it the Limay River Ranch that you have out in Patagonia?
Limay, right? Correct, Limay.
Limay,
Yep.
Limay River. So I'm not familiar. Obviously, I'm not familiar with the ranch there. Maybe talk about that. Fast forward us through until how you come to be running, down in Patagonia in the ranch there.
Well, so after my first, so it's a continuation in some regards, right? So I mean, I make it out to Montana. Randall, said, if you cut your teeth out there one season, then I'll call up people that I know. And he actually knew Jack Dennis and Mike Lawson very well, because that's how he spent his summers when he was young. He'd tie all winter long, make money, and then he'd come out, out to Yellowstone Park in order to fish his brains out all summer. And so he knew all the, like, Jack Dennis, Gary LaFontaine, Mike Lawson, they were doing that traveling like road show at that point.
That's right.
And so that's how Randall tied.
That was the Randall, right? Randall was it Umpqua Feather Merchants back in the day where they were doing the traveling road show selling their flies?
Yeah, that. And then Jack Dennis, Gary LaFontaine, and Mike Lawson, that trio, they were traveling together as well, like on a road circuit. And so, all those things sort of tied together. So I ended up being able to work for Mike Lawson, thanks to Randall Kaufman. He basically called Mike Lawson up, and I caught him in a building year maybe or something, and I was able to slip into Mike Lawson's team because considering my guide history, I certainly had no business being there. But and then my first training day with Mike Lawson, I actually rode Lawson and Gary LaFontaine down the river. So that
Oh,
was like
wow.
an amazing first day out on the Henry's Fork for me. But to fast forward, because of my involvement at Henry's Fork Anglers and the crossroads that place is in the fly fishing world, I ended up having a job offer to go down and guide in Patagonia. And so went down to Patagonia and guided there in the winters. I honestly, I didn't envision, staying in college or a graduate program, but then being able to go to Patagonia definitely trumped any other future life plans I thought I had made for myself. And met all kinds of great people. And then one of the people that I met my very first year in Patagonia was a guy named Javier Urbanski, who was an aquatic biologist. And he was the one that actually introduced me to the Limay the very first time that I went out and got to know it, because he was working for the state and they were doing quarterly impact studies on the river, because the dams are privately held. And then part of the contract that the dam has with the province was to do this quarterly impact study. Inversely, I think it was just the way that the province was able to fund most of carry most of they passed off most of the costs, for the aquatic biologist team. They just passed it off to the dam, by slipping in this contract or what have you. So, but anyways, I was able to go, and because I was sort of, I loved all the insects and all the science side of fly fishing. Javier and I instantly bonded because he was one of the few people that actually, knew, the science behind all these rivers. And so, I was constantly bombarding him with all these questions like, where are the big stoneflies? Are there any rivers with stoneflies? I haven't seen any salmon flies or golden stones. And so I could bounce all these questions off Javier. And, of course he was sort of a fly fishing geek like I was. And so we, got off on all this, sharing all this information. And so he drugged me out on sort of one of these like fact finding missions to the Limay. That was the first time I was introduced to the river.
Yeah, that's it. And then eventually you have a lodge now that you own out there.
Yeah, correct. So, I mean, the first trip that I spent out there was just, for me, was sort of earth shattering, the nature of the river. So, I mean, some of the data that we were getting in was, we collecting these fish, and we were, weighing, measuring, and then taking scale samples off these fish. And, I learned actually so much on that first trip. I mean, I'd never done that kind of, sort of work before. And, the first fish he looked at, he was like, "Oh yeah, it's a 17-inch fish. It's about 3 years old," which for me was, hard to believe. And he was like, "Well, yeah, you can just take a scale sample and put it under a microscope, and then you can tell exactly how many winters they've gone through," which I had never seen a scale under a microscope before. So that was, I thought that was just incredibly fascinating, and it turned out to be absolutely true. Every dark line was a winter.
Are those fish down there? They're brown trout, right? We're talking brown trouts, but are the brown trout similar? Is the fishing similar to Montana? What's that like when you compare the two? I'm sure you've probably done that before. You could do that pretty easily.
Yeah, so I mean they're exactly, similar. I mean, their trout are not native to anywhere south of the equator. So they were all introduced, but we're approximately equidistant from the equator in Patagonia compared to Montana, Idaho, Colorado, or what have you. So it's in that like ideal trout band, as far as distance from the equator. And in a lot of regards, so we have, caddis and mayflies and all the, essential food groups were naturally occurring in Patagonia before the trout were introduced. So, I mean, that they were just sort of missing that one key element in the rivers was the trout themselves. So they were introduced from northern, from northern hemisphere. The eggs were brought down and introduced into Patagonia. So
When was that? Do you know roughly when they were first introduced there?
yeah, it was between 1905 and 1911, at least on the Argentine side in Patagonia. That's when there was an active sort of breeding and introduction program. And after that, it was essentially I wouldn't say that abandoned, but it was sort of completed in that, in a very short little window. But since originally there were no dams, the fish were introduced into a couple key rivers, and then from there they were able just to expand within the given niche and fill, naturally sort of expand within these river systems and fill all the available niches. From there until, Joe Brooks and all those guys showed up in the late 50s, early 60s. I mean, they essentially had, 30, 40 years to expand within these virgin systems and come into their own, so to speak.
Right, right. And is that how it happened? I've heard some stories around in the U.S. where people like that, Mike Lawson, well, not necessarily Mike Lawson, but some other people around, around famous people back in those days where they planted, trout, like in the White River, and now you have these massive trout in the White. Is that kind of how it worked down there, where you had these Americans or other people going down and just like building this program?
Well, they definitely built a program, but it was an Argentine, and you'd have to reference back to Bill Leachy's book because he researched it pretty heavily. But it was a private party got the authorization from the Argentine government. But I understand that it was an Argentine himself that spearheaded the project, got the okay, went and collected or asked, and they were able to secure eggs out of the McCloud River in California. And then they got brook trout eggs from the Northeast, and then brown trout eggs from Europe, and then, shipped all these eggs down to Argentina, and then had them on, refrigerated cattle cars, essentially, that took them out to Patagonia. And then they created brood stock in, in these ponds and lakes in 1905. And then they were actively introducing, the fish for about like 10 years, essentially. And that or 8 to 10 years. And then that was about it. And so then all these sort of famous Americans or what have you, like Billy Pate and Joe Brooks, they came down in the late 50s, early 60s, but they were invited by Argentines like Bebe and Chorena and these famous, the first wave of Argentine fly fishers that invited them down to help expose the Argentine fly fishery, basically.
When it comes to high quality flies that truly elevate your fly fishing game, drifthook.com is the trusted source you need. I've been using Drifthook's expertly selected flies for a while now, and they never disappoint. Plus, they stand behind their products with a money-back guarantee. Are you ready to upgrade your fly box? Head over to drifthook.com today and use the code SWING at checkout to get 15% off your first order. That's Drifthook, DriftHook.com. Don't miss out. Fish the Fly Guide Service is dedicated to sharing the incredible fly fishing opportunities around Jackson Hole. Whether floating the scenic Snake River in search of native cutthroat trout or hiking into the mountains to explore pristine tributaries, every day on the water is an adventure. You can join them for an unforgettable fly fishing experience in the heart of the Tetons at fishthefly.com. So that's kind of how it happened, and it makes sense now. Yeah, it's at the same from the equator. Similar. What else are, when you, again, let's stay on that comparison, Montana versus, Argentina, for those that haven't been down there, what are there more similarities or more differences when you talk about the, the fishing and kind of the area and stuff like that?
No, I think that they're very similar. I mean, I think it's easy if you were, if you parachuted out of the plane and had no idea what zip code you were in or country code. I mean, you'd be hard pressed to define that, you weren't in parts of Wyoming or Montana or, or Colorado, for example. I mean, it's really hard to tell. You instantly feel, at home, and then over time, you start noticing differences in the flora, the fauna, what have you. But it's very much what fishing in the American West would have been like 50, 60 years ago.
Because of less people, even though Montana is not a very heavily, well, it's busier now, but is that the biggest thing, just the less people there?
Exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, the trout, except for their naivety, they behave exactly like they would in Idaho, Montana, or Wyoming. The difference is just fishing pressure, which I think, in talking with people in Montana, is like, well, why would I go all the way down there to trout fish? And because the experience of fly fishing is, sort of stumbling around on a mountain river with nobody else around. And I mean, I sort of have to go back to when I was 12, 13 years old to remember what that was like, right? Anymore, sadly enough, Montana's not, not the same. If you try to fish in Montana or on the Madison or Missouri in June and July, it's not the same experience that it used to be. The fisheries are still, in some regards, some of the rivers have been able to hold up, like the Missouri has been able to hold up. It's still a completely viable ecosystem, and others have not, and that's the sort of the biological reality of these rivers. I mean, like the Big Hole's gotten a lot of, press and,
Yeah, that's what I was kind of thinking, because we just had the Big Hole River Foundation on. We talked about some of like what they're doing to measure the changes and kind of stay on top of that or figure it out. So have you seen, I mean, again, they don't quite know what's going on, water quality, things like that, but have you seen the same, similar, not similar, but, any changes down there in Patagonia?
In Patagonia, no. I mean, you do see how fish adapt over time to pressure. That's undeniable.
Yeah, I'm just thinking more like what I'm going to is the fact that it seems like in the U.S. and the episodes we've had all over the country, climate change and increasing water temperature seems to be a common thing. You're not seeing that at all down there?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, for as far as, water's getting warmer faster over the course of a season, and when do our fall bugs start? I mean,
Right, you
usually
have seen some
frost.
changes. Yep.
Yeah, that's undeniable. I mean, but I think what's interesting is you're seeing, those effects without the effects of, maybe development
Right.
on those
It's one thing.
rivers.
Yeah.
So, you can kind of separate, what's essentially still pristine fisheries
Right.
with the effect of climate change. Like that you can see, because you can see certain elements in the environment. So for example, like, I mean, it sounds a little bit crazy, but you can actually time hatches to when wildflowers bloom, because you have the same effects of heat and sunlight or what drive those flowers to bloom, and those are the same effects that, like, solar units that then would push your first, like, little stones to hatch in the spring, and then you need certain amount of frosts and water temperatures to drop in the fall to kick off your mahoganies, your mahogany mayflies to hatch in the fall. I mean, so you see those cause and effects, and in Argentina and Patagonia, you're seeing it without, like, dewatering and potential for all that ag. I think, I don't know if, fertilizers. I mean, we've had clients from Ireland that talk about, the farms are using so many fertilizers, how that affects, fisheries. So what you're seeing is the effect of climate change without a lot of the other human variables, affecting the river as well. So it's a little bit pure in that sense. So climate change is certainly happening, and you see it in Patagonia for sure.
Yeah, you see it there. It's just, yeah, that makes sense. Just less of the other variables down there because it's more wild. It's
Exactly. I mean, and so I think that's part of, that being a scientist. I think that's part of what, is so hard on rivers like the Deschutes or the Big Hole to untangle all those variables, right? So,
yeah, because it's not just one thing, right? It's a bunch of things, and that's what makes it challenging. But yeah, it was interesting talking to the Big Hole Foundation, because they were just, it feels like they're trying to get a handle of it, and they're doing some good research. So that's good. But yeah, let's talk about basically the ranch, the lodge you have there. Now, where is it exactly? Where would people be flying into to get down there?
well, you still fly into Chapulco Airport, which is just outside of San Martin. The lodge and the river are about equidistant, actually, from either San Martin, Bariloche, or the provincial capital of Neuquén. But because our operations base, all our guides live in San Martin, that's where my wife's from. That's where our house is. Still logistically, it's easier to tie in, picking people up and dropping them off, because we're still fishing, sort of multiple rivers in a given sort of trip. So we're not just fishing the Limay, although that's one element of the trip. And more people are sort of, electing to, fish more days on the Limay or fish exclusively on the Limay. So the Limay, actually, if you look at the watershed, comes out from Bariloche out of a lake called Nuilhuapi, and it heads, east and then it joins up with another major tributary called the Kojankura, and then that heads into a whole series of these reservoirs, and then we're fishing it's a tailwater out from beneath one of these dams. But unlike the American West, which are predominantly all tailwaters, this is really the only tailwater in like the whole area that we fish. So
Right. And are these mostly brown trout down here as far as the species? And are these not sea run browns?
correct. These are not sea run browns, but actually, if you look at, sort of a cross section of the trout population in the river, it's about 60-70% rainbows, and then 30%, 30% browns in the river. And so what you have is you have sort of these resident, fish that live in the river year round. And then you have these migratory browns that come up out of the reservoir, out of the Chocon Reservoir, and they move up into the river, sort of periodically or seasonally. But it's, initially when I first went with Javier in about 2001 is when we went out and we're doing this sort of fact finding, impact studies. The Limay as a fishery wasn't unknown, or what they call the Limay Medio, or the middle Limay. It wasn't unknown as a fishery, but all the Argentines, the sort of hardcore, Argentine fly fishing society. I mean, they all went in May because it was known as a fall run of these monster brown trout. But what came to pass was, in truth, they move up into the river much earlier in the season than that, and that's sort of what we discovered. And we also sort of discovered a completely viable resident fishery in and of itself. So you have a very layered fishery. So it's, imagine sort of like the Missouri River if you had a run of steelhead, except, in this case, you have a run of these migratory brown trout that they're not coming from the ocean. They're coming out of, a reservoir that's, the size of Rhode Island, essentially.
Right. Yeah, and I think the Missouri kind of has some of that too, doesn't it? Some of those fish that are going up into the lake and kind of rearing and then eating, growing, and then coming back down. Well, there's a lot of stuff going on there, right, in the Missouri.
Correct. Yeah. And there, as opposed to the part that I fish, which is, near Wolf Creek, Craig, down to Cascade, that's more up in the land of giants. And so that's what you have there. You have a very, very short piece of river. And then you have these migratory, or this influx of these lake fish that are moving in and out of the river system, over the course of the season. Right. But it's not necessarily just a spawning run. So that's what the Limay was assumed to be initially, and then we found that, in truth, that it was much more dynamic than that.
Gotcha. What is, if somebody was wanting to plan a trip down there to the Limay? What is the on timing? When are the good best times when are you seeing most of your people coming down?
Well, so I mean, a lot of our travel down south is more dictated or guided by when people want to be out of the US, right? So January and February is super popular because that's just when they don't want to be in Chicago, or, whereas, the fishing season, our hatches actually run from, around the end of November through, mid-January. And then you come into sort of terrestrial time through, say around the first, cold snap in mid-March. So right about now. And then the fall starts, our fall bugs start around, maybe the end of March, and then run all the way into May. But these migratory fish, which sort of overlap, I mean, that creates a whole nother variable in the fishery. So you have, your resident fish are running anywhere from, 14 to 23 inches. And then you have these migratory fish that are coming up out of the reservoir. So, Javier, my aquatic biologist buddy, who actually now guides for us, these reservoir fish were getting to be 23 inches in 3 to 4 years. And they come up into the river, anytime the first ones start trickling in December. Usually they're throughout the system by mid-January. And then they're in the system from, mid-January all the way through May. And you have these sort of waves of fish that come in every time, because it's just like the White River in Arkansas. So you mentioned the White earlier. It's the flows on the Limay are not based on ag. They're based on electric, hydropower. So you'll have these massive fluctuations all the time. But from the inception of the river, from the minute they built the dam, that's how flows were managed. And so the whole fishery generated, or originated with that as a quantifier or what have you. So just like, you talk to like the old boy. I actually went to college in St. Louis. So I fished the white, not very much, but I fished the white some. And the old boys, they go out when it bumps. I mean, they go bounce, crawdads, off the bottom in the white, when the river bumps, that's the time to get those big browns. And so completely contrary to, anything that you would, so like on the Missouri, if they bump the water, 150 CFS, it'll totally screw up the fishing for the rest of the day. Whereas on the Limay, it doesn't follow any of the, normal patterns of what we're used to, or at least what I'm used to in Montana as far as flows and, fishing goes. Maybe it's a lot more akin to like Lee's Ferry or the White River. So just because the river comes up 3 feet doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. It's just changes.
You're still fishing it. How do you fish when you're fishing when it bumps up? How are you guys fishing that? Like, talk about that a little bit. Are you guys out there in boats, or how are you doing it? Find the big fish.
Yeah, so we're in drift boats. I had a fortunate opportunity in the early 2000s. Road drift boats at that point were being produced in St. Anthony, Idaho, and in the early 2000s they were making sort of their presence felt in the fly fishing world, and they were getting people like Lynn Sessions and the guides on the Henry's Fork. They were getting those guides into their boats, and so right around those early 2000s is when Roe came out with their first drift boat, which was a skiff, a low-sided boat. And then when I saw that, I was like, boy, that is the boat for Patagonia. Where we don't have crazy whitewater, our sort of the natural element we're fighting against is the wind. And so we were actually able to make a deal with Roe Drift Boats and got one of their molds down into Argentina and started making Roe drift boats in the early 2000s. So we're rowing Roe drift boats down in Argentina because Roe basically facilitated and allowed us to build their boats in Argentina. So
that's cool.
Yeah.
Do you see, is it mostly down there, mostly Roe drift boats, or do you see other drift boats too?
There's some other drift boats, but they've been boats that somebody imported and then they splashed it and sort of stole the model. But Roe is the only sort of legitimate authorized model of drift boat being used in Patagonia.
Yeah, it's the only one.
Cool.
Yeah, this is great. All right, I love a little drift boat talk. So you're out there in the drift boats, and you said again they're out there. These big fish are out throughout the whole season, kind of on and off. When, if you had to pick one time, would you say, it doesn't matter whether it's November or January or March as far as when you want to find those big fish?
For the biggest fish, I mean, we've had like peak weeks that will run anytime from mid-January through May. I mean, it's, as far as the big fish are going, you have to think about it much more like, steelheading. I mean, you're not going to go get 20, 30 of these, 23 to over 30-inch fish. You can have, big fish number days on the Limay, but they're not going to be these migratory fish. So, I mean, I think how dynamic the fishing experience is part of what makes it such an interesting river. So you can go from like 5X and fishing rusty spinners and, finding cods of rising fish to, fishing swung flies on 0X within the given hour and the given day. So I think that's what makes it such an intriguing fly fishing experience, and it's not, I love to steelhead fish and I will go and swing a fly all day, and I have so for, in the Clearwater and the salmon and up in BC and in Oregon and the Deschutes. But, it's really fun to sort of hybrid that experience with a sort of true classic trout, experience. So we've had peak days, and oftentimes it's right after one, when the river bumps, it'll turn on those fish in the, within that first 40 minutes. And then those big bumps will also, I think, bring fish up out of the reservoir into the river. So not only do you turn on, just like, you need a rain on those coastal rivers in Oregon to, turn those steelhead on or move them from one pool to the next and sort of re-energize them. You also get an influx of fresh fish into the river like you would on a coastal stream. So it's, these are all sort of working theories that, apply. But again, you're sort of looking at, at these migratory fish and then also how it applies to how like trout behave. But, again, steelhead are migratory trout. So
Yeah, there are trout. And is that how you fish those migratory? You swinging just like you would for steelhead?
exactly. Yeah. And so, I mean, think summer steelhead, right? Except these are brown trout, but they behave very
Or even Atlantic salmon, right? Because that's probably the closer species to the, or I guess, right?
absolutely. So, I mean, you can, again, these fish are, when we first showed up, I mean, we essentially, during the summer months, my partner, Diego Geyser, who I guided with, and then ultimately Javier started guiding with us in like 2006, 2007. I mean, we were applying essentially trout techniques, while you were drifting down the river. The classic way to fish the Limay was sort of step, swing. But now we're applying, drift boat. Now we're in a drift boat, which nobody was using on the river at that time. We were using suddenly now, okay, well, how do you copy, step swing out of a drift boat? And then yet we have to get between from one run to the next. So we might as well be drifting a fly from one drift to, from one run to the next. So then we'll fish for these rainbows in between these big brown trout spots. And then all your techniques sort of blend together, right? So while you're in between, sort of these holding spots for these big migratory fish, you're fishing rainbows and then you end up as a bycatch randomly and accidentally catching these big browns. So then you figure out that they will react to standard trout techniques. So we were raising migratory browns on a twitch and sit, like you would twitch a hopper or twitch a big terrestrial. Suddenly we were getting these 24, 27-inch browns to rise up to these dries. And so then we started mixing all these techniques, and then given certain conditions, it'll all work for both fish. So it's really
Right.
interesting.
So you guys aren't necessarily doing the get in like the steelhead and getting a run and spend an hour stepping, swinging through a run. You're not really doing that.
Not as much, because what we found was during the bright sun of the day, and a lot of this we were staying in this local town, and then you pay these local ranchers to come in to access the river. You'd pay this guy $15 to drive in the car, and you put in on one property and maybe take out on the same property, or put in on the son's property and take out on the dad's property. But we couldn't get in the river at dawn. And so some of these, we could catch those big browns in the heat of the day in the bright, sun at 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. But we were picking them up, in these big drops and these deep runs that were like 20 to 30 feet deep. But you could do it during the day, but you couldn't reach those spots. The majority of those spots you couldn't reach on foot. And so most of our fishing was sort of, and our tactics were, out of the boat in deeper water. And what we have found in running the lodge and then being able to go to the river in steelhead type, time frames, was that actually those big browns are coming out. And again, these are working theories that, we certainly don't have the final say or word on the river, but it seems to be that those browns are coming out and foraging at night. And then if you're there before first light, you can actually jump them in water that's less than a meter deep. Now you can actually walk and swing those runs with classic steelhead techniques, at dawn and dusk time frames. So
Gotcha. So that's it. So the sun. Yeah. So they are. So the sun. That's cool. So you could swing if you wanted to get out early or late. You have probably a better chance because they're in the shallower water.
exactly. Yeah. And then so now with, either a single-handed rod or a switch rod, now those fish are, you can reach them in those low light situations. That's what we've come to find. So
I
I
see.
mean,
Right. So there you go.
yeah, most clients are still, want to have breakfast at 8 and go out in the boat and not get up early and using the boat. They don't have to.
Right. They don't have to. But you could, if you were a hardcore swinger like Spey, you wanted to like catch, your thing with Spey all around the world and you wanted to swing one up traditional style, you could do it there.
Absolutely. Well, and what we ended up doing was we started using, and I, because I'm a steelheader, then I was applying these tactics. And so we started using switch rods out of the boat. And so you can't, I've only been able to do it, or I've only seen it done once out of a drift boat where I had two guys using switch rods, but you can comfortably use a switch rod out of the front of the boat. And it's really fun because if you think about it, and while I've fished a spey rod since, I don't know, maybe the late 90s, I'm far from an expert, but, as you wander down a run, you'll get little deeper pockets and shorter pockets, and suddenly you'll be within 2 steps, you'll be a foot shallower or deeper, and then that changes your anchor, right? So out of the boat, your anchor and your distance from the surface of the water is constant. So then your anchor and your stroke is constant. So it's quite easy out of the drift boat or out of these skiffs to, do a snake roll or a snap tee because your distance from the surface of the water is consistent throughout the whole day, right? So we weren't teaching people to do that, but we were teaching people, take a strip or two, do a big sloppy roll cast, and then overhand cast it. And so that would allow even, intermediate beginner anglers to consistently throw. Maybe it's just the head is, maybe 40, 45, 50 feet of line, but using the boat, that was enough to cover the sweet spots in all these runs. And so initially we were using like, 6 weight, like 12, 11-foot switch rods. We're using that at the front of the boat just to help people cover water using an overhand cast. And so that took a lot of the work out of covering water. And what we found in the guide day was trying to balance out, exposing essentially traditional trout fishermen to steelheading or steelhead techniques to cover these brown trout. So it was this whole hybridization of all these sort of techniques, which
Right. That's
was
cool.
really, really fun inventing all this stuff, right? So
Right. And at the same time, you're still getting the hatches, right, in those times, which is kind of March, you said, February, March, April?
yeah, so in January we're still getting caddis. It wasn't until we were there from November through December we started seeing all the mayfly hatches. And this all goes back to the first day that I was on the river with Javier. I was like, well, how are these fish getting to be 17 inches in 3 years? And he handed me the keys to the kingdom the very first day. He was like, well, it's all on caddis and mayflies. I'm like, well, so there's no micey shrimp or any of the, power foods that we associate with tailwaters, like sow bugs or micey shrimp or annelids. And no, it's all primarily, caddis and mayflies. Well, by default, all those bugs have to hatch. So, we get March browns and Cahills early in the season, November, December, and then the caddis start mid-December and it'll run through January. And I mean, I remember, what's strange is those McLeod rainbows are so chromy. They're a lot more like bonefish in color than, say, your Deschutes River red sides. And all of our trout in the American West have been hybridized. Like, so the Metolius is perfect, so there's probably, if you look at those, at the genetics of the trout that are in the Metolius today, you'll see white tips on their fins, and some of them will have little orange notches on their dorsal. Well, those are all, harken back to those McLeod fish. And then the standard, the native Deschutes fish are those red sides, and that's where you get, those darker colors and those, red cheeks. But the native original, strain that came out of the McLeod, they have very little pink, they're very chromy, very little color to those fish. And so the rainbows that are in the Limay are essentially, 100% pure genetics out of the McLeod, and they have hardly any, pink to them. So
Right. The coloration, that's interesting.
yeah, so the river is like New Zealand clear. I mean, at 15 feet, you can see every single rock and pebble on the bottom of the river. And that's why, some of these skating floating line techniques works in these, pools that are 20, 30 feet deep, is because the water's so crystal clear. But when you're floating down the river, you see hardly the only fish that you actually see are these monster brown trout. All the rainbows are, all you can see is their shadows. You don't actually see the fish. Initially, you think that there's like no fish in the river because you can't see them. And how can I not see them when I can see every pebble? But then you get one of these hatches and suddenly there's pods of 10, 15, 20 fish, feeding behind, a willow, and go, oh my God, well, there's thousands of fish in here, and true to any tailwater, it has those kinds of trout concentrations.
On DeMark Lodge offers a world-class experience with one of the finest rainbow trout and brown trout fisheries in the world. Their family-owned and operated Missouri River Lodge offers comfortable accommodations, delicious home-cooked meals, and personalized service that make you feel like family. Days on the water are capped off by appetizers, beverages, dinner, and stories on the back deck and around the campfire. Book your stay for an unforgettable fly fishing adventure where memories are made and the fish stories are real. You can head over right now to wetflyswing.com/ondemark. That's ONDEMARK on DeMark right now to book your magical Missouri River trip. What was it before, if you go back before the rainbows were planted, what was the native species that were in there?
The largest fish are called perca, they look like like a smallmouth bass.
Is that Burka? Was that with a B, or how do you spell
that? With a P, perca.
Oh, perca.
Yeah. And an Argentine will translate it to like it's a perch, but it has, they don't look anything like perch. They look much, a lot more like somewhere between a walleye and a smallmouth bass.
Oh, and a bass, right.
Yeah.
So do you guys still catch perca in there?
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't know that the perca tend to like, deep, slow pools, slow eddies. They predate on the trout for sure, but you will find them. I remember one of the first days I was floating the Cojuncura, which is one of the other, rivers close to Bariloche and San Martin. One of the Argentines we were floating behind as we scouted the river, like pointed out, this eddy, and there was a bunch of perca in there, rising on mayflies actually. And I spent, maybe 15 minutes before I realized that we were throwing to, a non-trout species. And the Argentine thought it was really funny that he had, waylaid us and diverted us throwing at these perca or what have you. But it was kind of funny.
God, that's great. So, but the most of the fish you guys are catching are trout. You're not catching a lot of perca?
No, I mean, if you threw sinking lines and streamers in the slowest, deepest pools, then you'd catch perca, and there's still perca in all the local rivers, but they don't live in the riffles and the runs. They're in the slowest, deepest pools, is the water that they prefer, and they do better in the warmer water, like the Cojuncura and the Illuminae.
Gotcha. Okay. So we've talked a little about, on just the species. And again, the trip, it sounds like it's pretty open depending on what you want to do. I mean, it doesn't really matter, I guess, if you want to hit a certain hatch or something. Do you find people are just coming whenever they have time off and, hitting that area? Or is there, if we were planning a trip, what would you tell us? When would be a good time to start?
Yeah, there seem to be two sort of avenues of how people plan their trips. And usually it's either like, hey, this is the window I have, that I've negotiated with my partner or my boss off, or when I can come down with my buddy or my wife. This is the time frame that I have, is one avenue, and what's the best fishing for these dates. Or, I'd like to plan a 8 to 10 day trip to Patagonia. When's the best time to come? And then, best time is quite relative to each individual person. And because these trips are all custom designed, then, and we have access to actually like 7 big ranches. So our lodge on the Limay is on an 80,000 acre property where we've got, over 30 miles of, private access. And that's really sort of the heart and the key of the beauty of these, the trips that we're putting together is being out on these monster, big what used to be sheep, and cattle ranches, now converted into fishing properties.
So that's what they are now. They're literally just fishing properties now. That's the focus.
Yeah, originally, in Patagonia, all these ranches really made money in wool and sheep. And then, the wool market sort of crashed in the 30s and the 40s. And Patagonia was, quite a tough place to be a rancher until maybe the last 20 years, where they could make money on some cattle. They're not great cattle properties, but they could make money on cattle. And then if they were fortunate enough to have a great trout river flowing through them, then they made, some money on trout. And then, and there's some red stag hunting down there as well.
Okay. Oh, right. And there's some hunting. So you get some hunters, probably a little both guys come down there hunting and fishing on the same trip.
Yeah. In March and April, you can do that on some properties. I mean, not every property is a great hunting property. Not every great, hunting property is a great fishing property, but there are some overlaps for sure on some of the properties. But a lot of it, is your over time, is we tend to get people will come back year after year. I mean, most people, it's like, sort of a bucket list. We need to go to New Zealand and Mongolia and we should go to Patagonia once. And I think that, a lot of people are surprised just by the quality of the experience. And we were probably at like 65% return clientele, because it surprises people, just how special it is to fish Montana 60 years ago.
Right. That's pretty much that. That's what you're providing, right? That's kind of the big thing. It's
Right.
Less people, all the natural beauty. What about some of the animals out there? What are you seeing? Are there many kind of the other animals that you wouldn't see in Montana?
Yeah, so the native animals that that you would see on the course of a trip are the guanacos, which is a type of llama, actually. But it's like a guanaco is like an alpaca, but not as heavy of a coat. They range, in groups of 10 to 20, 30, all over Patagonia. I mean, Patagonia is actually an area like the Rockies. I mean, it encompasses multiple, essentially multiple states or provinces, and it actually goes between Argentina and Chile. The most famous part is the part around the Andes, but the majority of it is wide open steppes, right? And that's where the guanacos really flourish, is in big, broad open steppes. And then there's a flightless bird that, if you looked it up on a bird book, is a lesser rhea. And then depending on what part of Patagonia you're in, are called choike or nandu. But it's a flightless bird that, if you saw, passing by in the truck, you'd think it was an ostrich or a rhea. And there's lots of those. Those are native. And then, red stag have been introduced out of Europe, as long as wild Russian boar. And then there's foxes. You have red foxes. There's puma. Those are native.
Oh, puma.
Yeah, there are puma, which is, the equivalent to a mountain lion.
Cougar, yeah.
Yeah.
Have you ever seen a puma out there?
I have. I've seen 3 down in Argentina. Actually, as I understand, again, this, you'd have to check it with a biologist, but I understand actually there's a higher concentration of puma now than there was originally, because since they introduced the red stag, and the red stag, the only, natural predator they would have would be the puma, because there's no, the
nothing big enough.
Right. The other largest predator are foxes and essentially coyote-sized foxes that aren't big enough, even in a pack, to hunt the red stag. So their only natural predator would be the cougar or the puma. So there's really high concentrations of puma now that they didn't historically have. So you have maybe 160,000 acre property, and they might, the gauchos, just on natural reflex will, it's just part of their nature, protecting sheep, over multiple generations of gauchos. They would just shoot a puma on sight. And 160,000 acre property, they might shoot 11 to 14 puma over a given year. So that gives you a sense of the concentration of puma that are out there. But I've seen, you fish an evening hatch until dark and driving clients back. I mean, I've come across maybe, I guess I've seen 4 puma over my career since 1995 down there, without going and looking for them, but just
Sure.
stumbling across them.
Kind of like similar. That's similar to the cougars back home, right? You might see, if you're lucky, see 2 or 3 or 4 of those in your, over your life, maybe.
Yeah, I've seen one in Orofino. I mean, I think my dad's seen two elk hunting in the Blue Mountains and around. I mean, it's not very common to see a cougar in the wild unless you're trying to find them.
Yeah, awesome. Well, this is great. I think I want to get some tips, talk a few tips and tricks here, but let's start to take it out of here in a bit. This is our travel segment. Obviously, we're traveling down there. We're also putting together a trip, like we said, Atlantic salmon. That is a big one on our bucket list. And want to give a big shout out to Mountain Waters Resort. We're heading out to fish Atlantic salmon in Newfoundland. And the cool thing is that, we'll have a group of people up there. I haven't done this yet, so it's going to be exciting to chase those down. So we're going to give a shout out to Mountain Waters Resort. On this part of the segment, I just want to ask you, it sounds like you've obviously been in a couple of big places. Do you have trips out there you're still looking at, or do you even have time to get out and go chase, fish other places around the world?
Well, actually, I just did. I just went up to BC for the first time, which was a lifetime bucket list. And boy, it's hard not to fall in love with that place. Holy Toledo. That was really magical. I fished the Sustat with Sweetwater Travel.
Sustat. Now, is the Sustat, what system? Is that on the Skeena, or is that a different system?
Yeah, that's way high up in the Skeena.
Oh, okay.
It was right. Yeah, so it was a phenomenal experience. And it was the water was really cold, but I skated dry flies through my whole week there, and so it was really neat.
No kidding. Did you guys have any action?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, I think I caught probably 80% of my fish that way because I just stuck with it. That's the only way I really wanted to catch them. So I was just as happy to turn one as I was to catch one. So it was fantastic. And then, Jim Klug and those guys have turned me on, and, I've been able to jump on a last minute canceled spot, and chase tarpon down in Belize and stuff. So that was really fantastic.
Amazing.
But there's tons of destinations all over the world to hit.
Still. I know. Yeah, that's it. Well, you got a couple. You're in 2 of the hot spots, so that you got that covered. But what was that fly you used in BC? The skater? Did you use a bunch or just one main fly?
I had a friend of mine, Steve Schmidt, that owns Western Rivers Fly Fishers in Utah and Salt Lake. He showed me some patterns that his favorite steelhead guy up there out of Smithers. And honestly, I wish I could do him justice saying, who it was. I can't remember now, but he showed me a pattern and then I sort of adapted it. But it's got moose outriggers. And then, so I adapted it for steelhead. And then that's where I adapted that pattern and actually use it on the Limay quite a bit. So it's just the foam and then with moose outriggers, and then you can tie it in different color combinations. Moose, obviously it's like one of the stiffest natural fighters. So, but you can get it bleached. It tends to, the fibers aren't quite as stiff if you bleach it, but you can bleach it, and then you can get into tans and then combine that with pinks and but black and purple is great and low light. And then, you can use gold and tan, like you've got your muddler colors. If you work in those color combinations, or tan and pink. So I use those in BC and then use them on the Limay.
And the Limay, right? So you could use skate up on the Limay too. You could do that same stuff down there.
Absolutely. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Wow. So you could get one of those big migratory browns on a skated fly.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to,
It's hard to do, right?
If you're a steelheader, then if you go in knowing, okay, my target is 1 or 2 fish a day, then you can, in my guiding career, that's all I did for the last 15 years. But there is a certain human element in not pulling the fly away, because the beauty of fishing that skated fly out of the boat in this crystal clear water is you get to see you see the pre-eat, which is so amazing. But, if you're a trout fisherman, then it's really easy to pull the fly away. So if you're a steelheader, then you can sort of have your nerves of steel and wait it through.
Right.
So it's a lot easier to catch them on, a swung streamer, because you're taking the human element out of it. But I'd say in general, your productivity, you will get as many fish to the fly, whether you're fishing a floating line and a skated fly, or or a sunk fly. In most days, it honestly doesn't matter. But there's a lot of days at 2 o'clock in the afternoon where you haven't raised one. And so people are like, gosh, should we change the fly? And my response was always, well, how about we change the music? But, if it's easy to fall back on, we'll just fish a streamer and, at 4, we finally got one on the streamer. Whereas if you stuck with a dry, you'd still get the one on a dry, but it's easy to fall into that.
Yeah, you got to stick with it. We have a series of episodes. Actually, it's Brian Nisk at the Skeena Bay Lodge. He hosts our like West Coast steelhead stuff, and he had he was doing an episode recently where they're talking about one of the guys there just fishes dry flies in the wintertime for steelhead. Right? It's that's all he does. So again, it all comes back to what you want to do. Right? You said like you did up in BC, you did the same thing. You're like, hey, I'm not gonna fish any wet flies. Right? You fish dries the whole time.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, I stuck with dries, and as far as fish to the fly, compared to everybody else that were throwing tips, and once the river's stable, I didn't notice any different in camp that week. For example, I mean, there was a definite difference when we got some rain and the water was off color. Then that obviously switches everything. But when conditions were stable, I didn't see any difference whatsoever as far as fish to the fly.
Yeah, that's it. Okay, cool. And I'll put a link to that episode 15 of In the Bucket, Adrian Cortez.
Nice.
And he's the guy, and then Richard Harrington has the podcast, The River Rambler. So we'll get a link out to that. Let's give a couple of quick tips here. So if you're thinking brown trout, let's just think of fish in Patagonia. Are there any, a few 2 or 3 tips you give you give somebody new to Patagonia down there fishing that also maybe might work in Montana? Or is it pretty specific? If you had to say somebody's coming there, let's just take them to that dry fly. We're not talking the swinging. We're talking just catching some brown trout on the surface. What's the key there? What are some few things you should know before getting into that trip if they're on their way down there?
Well, I think for both the rainbows and the browns, like just trout fishing in Patagonia, they will react to a lot more movement on your fly compared to, rivers out west. That might not be true of all rivers out west. I know on the South Fork, they like to fish a hopper with an occasional twitch, but for the rivers that I guided on, usually you've got to work hard to achieve long drag-free drifts for well-educated fish, in Montana, whereas in Patagonia, they're still so naive that they actually will oftentimes react a lot better to, having movement on your fly. And that's just, angler pressure on the river. So they just haven't been popped, enough down in Argentina to, educate them against reacting to that movement.
What is that? What you call it before? What's the type of twitching, or what do you do down there? How would you describe it?
I call it like the twitch and sit. So like every like 3 to 4 feet, you might like give it a little pop.
Just kind of pop up your rod a little bit, pop your tip up.
Yeah. And then there's also times where you're essentially fishing, topwater streamers. So these are, flies that wake like wounded minnow type patterns where the fly is actually like a struggling minnow in the surface. Again, you think about those apex predators. So you see it on the White River. Those guys are really successful with mice patterns at night, but so those are low light situations where those predators come out. The difference is that, their feeding behavior doesn't seem to be so nocturnal compared to the States. So they'll eat in bright light, but it's more like, coming across an apex predator, on the Serengeti. Like those lions don't eat every day, but when they do, they'll, those big brown trout will eat all kinds of stuff. I've caught them, where they've burped up frogs. I found a brown trout one time with a garter snake in its gut. Browns will eat all kinds of stuff if they're ready to eat, if it's worth enough calories, right? So
yeah, and that top rod or streamer, what is that? What a fly look like that you're fishing that?
Well, imagine like our early versions where if you imagine like a woolly bugger, like a white woolly bugger with a Chernobyl ant on top of it. We called those early manifestations, we called them Chewbacca's, is what we called those.
Right,
flies.
That's good.
But that's essentially what it is. If you took a woolly bugger, a skinny woolly bugger, and then you put a Chernobyl ant on top of it.
Yeah, so it's floating, right? The woolly bugger's just floating in the surface.
Right.
And then you got some sort of a waking thing on it, or how How are you getting? What's the action you're putting on that fly?
Well, and it would depend. I mean, we had because again, those browns, like when they were turned on, and they are exposed to there are still lots of native minnows in the rivers down there, so you could fish those flies on on a streamer strip. So just like you would strip a streamer, you could strip those topwater flies as well.
Yeah, right. God, that's great. Nice. So yeah, we got a couple of tips. And what else? Just generally, if somebody is again thinking about Patagonia, what do you think is somebody is new to it, their first time? What do you think is the most surprising thing that most people, when they get down there, they didn't think of? They weren't, they were surprised to see when they get there.
I mean, I think it's a mix. I mean, I think that people are surprised just, like how friendly, how easy it is to be in Argentina and Patagonia. I mean, people have the same reaction on the Chilean side as well, but just how welcoming, how easy it is to be there. I mean, the Argentines are really quick to make friendships and give you a hug. And I think that how open, the people are is really welcoming and surprising. And then just how pristine those fisheries are, and I think hopefully the distance away from, the population centers will keep them protected. And it's sort of the very thing that makes them special is maybe what'll be their downfall. But I think, because certain fisheries certainly have, 5 times, 10 times as much traffic as they did when I was there, when I first arrived.
Oh, right. Yeah. So it's getting busier. It's getting busier there than it was when you started.
Undeniably. I mean, when Diego and I first, and Jack and Javier, when we first started floating the Limay, I mean, we literally didn't see another boat for 10 years.
Wow.
During the January to March timeframe. I mean, just nobody else was fishing the river, because that's not when you went there. You went there, like Montana guides go to the Clearwater. You go after your trout season's over. So they would go end of April and May. And I mean, we essentially had the river to ourselves, in December, late December through March. We had it to ourselves for like a decade. And so eventually, now maybe we see, because the logistics of these properties are so massive, it's not it's not easy doing an overnight float trip. I mean, it's just not easy keeping ice cold for longer than 4 days, right? And that's what the logistics demand in floating through some of these properties, where you have a public access to a public access, or a public access to a pay and play access. So it's just not easy logistically floating through some of these properties.
So that's the cool thing about with the ranch, is that you guys have these areas where you can kind of do these like day trips, and it's essentially you have easy access. Is that kind of versus say somebody coming down there trying to DIY it or something like that?
Correct. I mean, DIYs, I mean, yes, you can go and park on some public access spots and wade into the river, because, like Patagonia falls under the same laws as
Oh, it does.
Montana.
It's public access.
Yeah. So once you're in the water, you can hike up and down as far as you want. But, these properties, some of these properties have anywhere from 10 to 40 miles of private access. So, I mean, a normal person can, is only going to walk a mile or two in, and then you still have to get back to your car. So, and then, having all the infrastructure in order to do an overnight float trip, that's not just something to pack in your duffel bag.
Yeah, this is definitely right. Patagonia, this area is probably, the DIY is tough, even though I know there are some people that do it. It's, getting some sort of a connection. Do you guys do something where, somebody could come down there, maybe, maybe they're going to be down there for an extended period. They come and fish with you guys, and then people are going off and hanging out, or is it more people are coming down just for the week and then that's their trip?
Yeah, most people come down for anywhere from 7 to 12 days of fishing. I mean, we've had a lot of the people that come down are retired. So we've had people that, come down for a month, and we'll do like, fish 4 days and then take a couple days off and fish 4 days or what have you. I mean, I've always kidded and said, we're in the business of saying yes as much as possible. But there's a ton of, well, I wouldn't say there's a ton, but there's a significant number of expats that, come down and rent a house for the season, and then, rent a truck, and especially, early and late in the season, there's a lot of, pretty quality public access water that you can fish. I mean, in our area, I think it's pretty well balanced, that you have, about half the rivers are easily accessible, through public access. And then the other half is you need a boat or private access. I think it's, in a lot of ways, it's a good model to show how, diverse types of access can really facilitate lots of different types of use. I think that, you can make a good case in Montana now that the state's reeling back and trying to figure out, well, how do we protect the experience of fly fishing that we've really overrun, and then balance out with, sort of the public right of everybody should have the right to go and fish, which everybody should have. But how do you protect that with, you know, fisheries that are overused, or you can even say abused? Those are difficult issues right now that, Montana's trying to deal with. And you can see in function how well it works in Argentina, where you have high-end businesses that, exist because of limited access, and yet still half the river is openly accessible through public access. And those people, rent homes and pay for hotel rooms and pay for ranches. And so I think there you see a potential working model for multifaceted use, right? But of course, the pressure is always going to be to, cut down fences, and we should have access to, these what are essentially public fisheries, but you can't go through private lands to get to them. So these are working issues, right?
Yeah, they are. No, it's interesting. It's cool to hear the the differences, right? And similarities between the two places. And since you're there, it's really interesting. Well, I think, Ron, we can leave it there for today. We will send everybody out to cleflyfishing.com. That's CLE flyfishing.com for Chocolate Lab expeditions. And just give us on the Chocolate Lab. Where does that? Is that do you have some dogs running around there? Is that where the name comes from?
Yeah, well, our first dog, when I had the job offer and I went down to guide in Montana, I had just got my first dog, which was a Chocolate Lab, Molly, and so ended up traveling down with her occasionally on some seasons. And so it was actually with my wife Vanessa. It was one season where we didn't know where we were going to rent and live, so Molly stayed home with my parents. And so in a moment of emotional weakness, we decided we would start our own business, and Molly wasn't there, so we named the business after her.
Oh, there you go. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Cool. All right, Ron, we'll send everybody out there and they can take a look and also check in with you on your everything that you have going there in Montana as well. But yeah, I appreciate your time today. This has been awesome. And definitely, I think what you've done is shed light. Again, like you said, some people are like, hey, I'm in Montana. What do I need to go to Argentina for, Patagonia or whatever? It's like, I think you spotlighted it today that, yeah, it's the experience, and it's, it's not the same. It's a different area. So yeah, appreciate your time today and look forward to staying in touch.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dave. We really appreciate the opportunity.
All right. That sounds unbelievable, right? You always wondered, I'm sure if I'm talking to some right here, you've been down there already. Maybe you haven't been to this part of Patagonia. Maybe you haven't been down there at all and you're interested. This definitely is a place where you can mix it up, a mixture of migratory fish, trout fishing on the surface. If you get a chance, check in with Ron at CLE, that's CLE flyfishing.com. Let him know you heard this podcast and check in and find out what he has going on. Pick his brain a bit. If you haven't already, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcast, and you'll get the next episode delivered to your inbox. I want to give a quick shout out before we get out of here. We talked about the Missouri on this episode. We are doing a Missouri trip this fall. If you go to wetflyswing.com/Missouri, right now you can find out how many spots we have available. We're going to be hitting this for some of the big hatches in Montana, switching it right around. We're not heading to Patagonia, but we are going to Montana. So if you're interested, check in or send me an email, dave@wetflyswing.com. All right, take a deep breath. And let's get on to the next thing. Hope you have a great morning. Hope you have a great afternoon or great evening, wherever you are in the world. Even if you're in Patagonia right now listening, appreciate you for stopping in today. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks for listening to the Wet Fly Swing Fly Fishing Show. For notes and links from this episode, visit wetflyswing.com.